So the long wait for my Hunt BFS rods from Kistler, they're finally here. These are the first production ones, and so let's go out back and get a first look at them, see how they look. Well, hey, it's been a busy day of travel. I just got back from out of state visiting family. Tomorrow I'll go over the specs, but today I gotta see them. And I gotta tell you, when Trey and I first talked about this, and basically he said, yeah, this is something I want to move forward with. And then he started asking me what I wanted, and he offered a signature rod. He's like, do you want a signature rod? I'm like, well, yeah. His response was like, well, we're absolutely doing that thing. But I never imagined that when it came down to it, he would say, why don't we just put your name on the entire line? And so that's where the Hunt Bait Finesse series rods came from, is we're just using my last name. And so, so let's see what they look like. It looks so good. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. In some ways, it feels like I've been waiting almost my entire life for these rods, but you know, we just started at the beginning of this year, and I have been nothing short of amazed with these rods. Now, there are 4 different sizes. We've got the 4X in a 6 foot and a 6'6", and we've got the 3X in a 6'8" and a 7 foot. When I started speccing out, you know, what rods that I wanted, I was really trying to cover like all of the different types of bait finesse fishing that I do, which is quite frankly all of the fishing I do. So the 4X 6 foot rod I really had in mind, you know, those wading trips when I'm in a tight trout stream, or I'm you know, just in tight creeks in general, fishing for bass and panfish, and you know, you're surrounded by trees and weeds, and the shorter the rod, the better off you are. Now, I have fished with some rods down in the 5 foot and the 5'3" range. I just personally tend to like the 6 foot range just a little bit more, and honestly, length is important in bait finesse, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. You know, so that was the 6 foot rod, and then the 4X 6'6" rod. It's not just for small fish, right? But it's for very small presentations, and so I wanted something a little bit longer to be able to fight those bigger fish. But when I'm throwing really light, like near ultra finesse stuff, right? That 4X range is. It goes down below 1 gram, and it can go up to around 6 grams. So, you know, when you're throwing those really small, you know, 1/8 ounce, maybe up to 1/4 ounce, but down below that, that's what we were looking for with the 4X. So I wanted something that could still handle a larger fish. So I think my largest smallmouth of the year came on that 4X. And so, you know, if you've ever fished for smallmouth before, you know how those suckers can fight, you know, and so you get a few pound smallmouth fighting hard in a creek, in current. Yeah, it's you know, it can be a heck of a lot of fun. And so, you know, that one was a little bit of a battle. But the backbone on these rods, because the action, and I want to get into the action in a second, you know, the action is not typical of what you're going to find in a lot of rods. I distinctly remember fighting that fish saying, this fish is not as big as he's fighting, I don't think. Right? And then when I saw it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a really nice fish. But that was on one of the lightest rods that I fish on, and it was this Kistler Hunt Bait Finesse series, and it had plenty to control that fish. So the other size rods, we have the 3X size in a 6'8" and in a 7 foot. You know, the 6'8" I think is really, that's sort of going to be my everyday rod. In fact, when we first started talking about, you know, naming these and we're finalizing the designs, I said to Trey, I'm like, hey, we've talked about maybe a signature rod, and if there is going to be one, it's that 3X 6'8". I do think that's going to be my everyday rod. But I wanted a 7 foot rod too. And so, you know, that's this one. Now, the amazing thing is that extra few inches of length doesn't really add much weight. It's like 1 gram of difference, which is amazing. And so speaking of weights, you know, these range on the 4X 6 foot down to about 74 grams. Up to about 88 grams on the 3X 7 foot. So these are very light rods. You know, the lightest carbon rod that I'd used before, you know, that has good sensitivity. It wasn't something just really cheap from AliExpress. Was the 5'3" Yamaga at 66 grams. So this is a 6-foot blank with a cork handle, and it's only coming in at 74. So I'm very thrilled with the weight on these. So we did make a few changes on the final rods from the prototypes, and that's sort of the point of prototyping, right? Is figuring out what needs to change. So we did 2 different rounds of prototypes. The only changes from the second round of prototypes were Trey made the decision to switch over to the Fuji micro guides instead of some of the other ones that we've been experimenting with. You know, these are handmade in America. Try to use American components as much as possible. And so we were trying out some really good guides, but the Fujis are just a little bit better. The anti-wrapping on the tip seems to be better on the Fuji guides as well. The reel seat had to change just because when we got down to the 6-foot on the 4X, the exposed blank reel seat that we had originally been working with, it actually wasn't small enough to hold the blank properly. So we did make that change. And then the other one is the handle lengths are variable for 2 reasons. One is balance, right? We want these to be extremely well balanced. But the second one is just from a leverage perspective. You know, the longer the rod is that goes out past the handle, the more I went down here at the end. So we did make one 6'8" with a short handle. I'm gonna run down and get that real quick. So this is the 6-foot 4X in the final design. This is actually a 6'8" in one of the original prototypes. And so you can see that it was a good bit shorter. But that leverage made a lot of difference. It's one of the first changes that we made. The trigger on the very first prototype, I didn't love the way it felt on a Finesse low profile reel. I didn't love the way that trigger felt, so we did go to a little bit more subtle trigger, but it fits a variety of grips much better, whether you're gonna palm, whether you're gonna hold it, I don't know what all the grips are called, but 2-finger, 3-finger, it all seems to work. Even if you're a 1-finger type person, I think this reel seat works better. From the exposed blank, you can see it wasn't a lot, but it's the same thing. It allowed us to change this trigger as well, just for a little bit more comfortable grip. So now there are a few questions that have come up since I did the initial announcement video of the Hunt Bait Finesse series rods. One of the questions that I get is like, well, what's the tonnage of the blanks? So here's the thing, Kistler has not in the past disclosed their manufacturing process on their blanks, and we're not gonna start now. These are based on the same KC8 Kistler carbon blanks. They've just been redesigned to be a little bit more finesse, actually a lot more finesse. They're 100% Toray carbon out of Japan. They are made in the same factories that the blanks are made for all of the other Kistler rods. What I can say is they're high modulus, they're nice sensitivity. The next question that sort of ties into that a little bit is like, well, what's the action? Are these fast or are these moderate? The answer is no, right? Because as we started working on these, Trey told me, he's like, these don't conform to the standards of action. They're just not on the chart. And so that's based on 30+ years of history of Trey making rods. These things aren't like anything else. What I ended up feeling when we got these 2nd generation blanks in, I feel like we've achieved the sensitivity and the weight benefits of carbon, but it bites a little bit more like glass, and it seems to keep fish pinned better for me than a lot of the fast carbon rods. I'm not a huge fan of extra fast rods. I do like what a nice fast rod can do for helping you cast light weights. With these, I can do just a little wrist flip, you know, and so that's all I need to get a really nice cast on a nice low flat trajectory. Ultimately, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that when I'm in tight spaces or I just want to flip it under something, just a little flip of the wrist will do it. Again, this is finesse techniques, right? We're not talking about, you know, make sure I'm okay here. You know, this rod is not designed for a 2-handed cast. You can theoretically do it, but in finesse fishing, I don't see that as what you're trying to do, right? Finesse fishing is about smoothness, it's about accuracy, it's about casting lighter weights than what you would do typically. You know, the action on these, we don't have a word for it yet. There's not a huge standard on a lot of things in rod manufacturing, which can make it confusing sometimes. So, you know, we probably have to come up with some name for the action on these, but right now just know that they fish in a very finesse manner with a very nice progressive bend in them. They still have the backbone. It's like as the rod bends, it stiffens up more, and so the lower you get into it, you still have the ability to fight a fish. But it's closer to fighting a fish on a fly rod than it is on a conventional bass setup that you would see in a tournament fishing. Right? You're not going to horse this thing out of the grass or out of lily pads on a BFS rod and then get it up to the surface and make it ski across the top of the water to get to the boat. This is really more about angling. And so how do you get to the point where you're presenting small presentations to pressured fish, wary fish, maybe old, very experienced fish that have seen a lot of the traditional stuff? That's what Bait Finesse is about. It's about being able to scale down your size to throw. It's almost like a snack. You know, if you see your favorite snack, sometimes even a donut qualifies for some of us, right? But if you see your favorite snack, like, oh yeah, I can have a couple nuts, I can have, you know, a little piece of cheese or something, right? You may not want steak and potatoes right then. You may not want a big meal, but a snack's sort of hard to resist. And in my mind, that's sort of what we're doing with Bait Finesse. A lot of times we're throwing smaller versions that's really hard for a fish to resist because they are opportunistic feeders. You know, action, it's a softer action, but it really has the ability to fight big fish. And then that leads me into a little bit of like, well, why are they called 3X and 4X ultralights? What happened to the 2X? What happened to the 1X? So as I mentioned before, you know, sometimes in rod manufacturing, there's not a lot of standards out there. One person's light might be somebody else's ultralight or medium light. One person's medium might be somebody else's light. So there's this gray area for sure. And so what these are based on is on Kistler's entire line. So Kistler already had an ultralight model. And when we got into this, we said, okay, well, we need something a little bit lighter than that, and we'll call it the 2X. And that was our first prototype. And then we started testing that. My mindset was like, okay, this is really close to power Bait Finesse, so we need something lighter, and then something lighter still. And that's basically what Trey said. He's like, okay, guys, we need something lighter and something lighter still. And so it became 3X and 4X. What that creates is, you know, our 3X rod, it's a 3X ultralight. I've thrown down to around 1, but it's not as repeatable. It will go above that as well. Just, you know, between you and me, a wacky rig, a 5-inch Senko wacky rig is like 11.5 grams usually. And I've thrown that all day on those. I've thrown some nice buzz baits on it. It definitely will handle more, but it loses some accuracy. And so that's why, as we went through and said, okay, what's the range on these? I was really looking for what's the range that you get really repeatable casts, because accuracy is a premium. So just know that if you're going to push the boundaries of the ratings on these, you're probably going to lose a little bit of accuracy. At least I do. So that's where the 3X and the 4X comes from, is that it's in relation to the rest of Kistler's product line. So there is some consistency and standardization between the Kistler family, and that's what we're looking for. So when I talked about my goals of designing these, you know, part of why I was thinking some of those things and wanted rods from one product line to cover all of my fishing is, what I find is that when I switch up setups and they're completely different, that early on my accuracy suffers a little bit. I might make long casts, I might make short, whereas, you know, going with one family of rods that can cover the entire thing, it's a much more consistent feeling, right? And I have a better experience on the water because the rods perform about the same within their range. So the next thing that was very important was the parabolic action. When it comes to Bait Finesse, when you want to fish with 4-pound or 6-pound or 8-pound line, and you want to catch 4-pound or 6-pound or 8 or even larger fish, you want to do it on those light lines. The rod has to do a good bit of the work for you, right? You have to be able to use that as a shock absorber, because, you know, when a trout jumps, when a bass jumps, shakes its head, when a bass turns or a trout turns and runs in a completely different direction. On light line, we cannot react that fast. So the rod gives a lot more, and it has really allowed me to land a lot more fish. In fact, I've lost one fish. It was on the 2X prototype not long ago, and I was fishing a river and I had a decent sized smallmouth that basically just made a beeline to the bank, and there was a little cut in and I couldn't get around to where it was, and it broke me off on some rocks. That's the only fish that I've lost. Knock on wood, that's the only fish that's broken me off. Like, I've had other fish spit the hook. But to me, that's a huge testament to what we're trying to do. I don't want to leave excess line in the water. I don't want to leave lures in fish's mouths. Just because that's not good for the fish, it's not good for the environment. But also, I don't like the heartbreak of having a fish break off. And so I would much rather have the ability to absorb those runs, you know, and play the fish a little bit more. And it's also why I use a net, right? Some people give me a hard time for netting a 6-inch bass or an 8-inch trout. We're on light lines, we're on light rods. And I would much rather be secure in landing that fish and try to prevent them from flopping around and doing everything else, or worst case, breaking off right at the bank. And so that action is very important when you're fishing ultralight rods. If you're trying to fight a fish with the rod perpendicular, right, and you're trying to bring a fish in, you lose a huge percentage of your leverage to be able to pull that fish in. Whereas if you fight that fish over on the side and you're pulling it in this way, instead of trying to pull it in this way, you have so much more control over that fish. And what that allows you to do with these rods, with the action that they have, right, it allows you to fight that fish a lot more. And you can see how it really starts to stiffen up down in the blank. You know, even the shortest 4Fs. Right? It bends well into the blank before it starts to really stiffen up. You know, so these really are unlike anything that I've fished before. And you know, when I first fished that second generation prototype, I'm like, oh my gosh, to me this is it. The last part of what I wanted is I wanted something that could do bottom contact well, could fish jigs, it could fish any you know, Ned rig, stuff like that, so you could feel what was going on, but also could go after some of my trout, could do some of my crankbaits with treble hooks and moving bait type stuff. And that's I really think what we've got is that. So as I've said before, for me this is pretty much all the benefits of carbon and all the things that I like about glass. And I still have a couple glass rods in the garage. I don't know if I'll be fishing them this year or not. We'll see. I don't want to fish anything else other than these. Not just because my name's on them, but that doesn't hurt. Ultimately, what I was looking for is, I was looking for the rod of my dreams that I just couldn't find. As a kid growing up on the Ohio River, all I ever really wanted to do was go fishing. Now, with these rods, the fact that Trey decided to put my name on them right beside his, these Hunt Bait Finesse series rods from Kistler, these really are a dream come true. And quite frankly, I think they really are the way bait finesse style fishing should feel. So they're available now. They're not a budget rod, they're a premium offering, but they are the rod that has made me stop shopping for rods. I didn't want to do this in a way that was compromised. And I will say this much, from day one, Trey has put pretty much zero restraints on me. And from Trey's 30 plus years of rod building experience, you know, these are unlike anything else that he's ever seen. Maybe that's what happens when you have a guy who never really designed fishing rods, who just wants something to perform the way he wants it to perform. Maybe that's the result. You're going to end up with something a little bit different. These aren't just another rod. These aren't just like everything else out on the market. I haven't really fished anything like these in the past. And so if you want something that fishes different, if you want something that maybe answers all of the things that you've always wanted in a finesse rod as well, maybe these are the ticket. They're not the cheapest rods, they're not the most expensive, but I do believe they're the best. Look forward to seeing these a lot over the coming years. I'm not even gonna say coming months. You know, this is it. This is this is 50 years of fishing for me coming to a head, and it's like finally I'm happy. With that, use the link below, support the channel, get yourself some. That's it. See you on the water.